Welcome to Unit 2, The Media of Art. Lesson 8, Printmaking. The term printmaking describes processes for creating multiples. The four basic categories of printmaking, relief, intaglio, lithography, and screen printing, are discussed in this lesson. Each of these categories has a number of associated processes. Descriptions of many of these media and examples are explored in order to reveal their unique characteristics. The objectives for this lesson are to define printmaking terms such as print, matrix, edition, and artist proof, summarize the origins of printmaking in China and Western Europe, identify the artistic, social, and political functions of prints, distinguish methods of relief, intaglio, and lithographic printmaking processes, recognize the use of stencils, screen printing, and digital technologies as contemporary forms of printmaking, and compare the sculptural practice of working in additions to printmaking. The outline for this lesson will be covering purposes of printmaking, relief, woodcut, wood engraving, linocut, intaglio, engraving, dry point, etching, lithography, stencil and screen printing, and contemporary approaches.
This lithograph is titled Quiver from 2008. It's by Tanya Softic. The one thing all prints will have in common is that you can make multiples from them. It varies from artist to artist on how many multiples they decide to make. By the end of this lesson, you will notice that prints can come in many different varieties. Printmaking has a history of over 1,000 years, so it has gone through many changes in methods and techniques. Printmaking is defined as a variety of techniques developed to create multiple copies of a single image. It was developed and advanced in Europe during the 15th century. Before 1415, every book and manuscript in Europe was hand-lettered and hand-illustrated. Even though printmaking was advanced in Europe during the 15th century, it actually originated in China around the 9th century. Just to familiarize you with the process, making a print for art's sake is not much different at all than making newspaper prints. They are for making multiples. This is a example of a letterpress. If you look in the upper left-hand corner, the letter is poking out from the surface of the block. That's actually called relief. That's one of the first processes we'll be going over. Upper right-hand corner is an example of a letter printing press. In the lower left-hand corner, we have an example of a plate that would be typically used, say, for a newspaper, invitations, anything like that. Now, on the right lower-hand corner is the result of the printing process of the plate on the lower left-hand corner. Relief printmaking is pretty much where it all started. In relief printmaking, the printmaker cuts away all parts of the printing surface not meant to carry the ink, leaving a design to be printed in relief at the level of the original surface. The surface is then inked, and the ink is transferred to the paper with pressure.
The earliest examples of printmaking originating in China were woodcuts. Woodcut is a relief process, as the explanation just showed, and the earlier versions of woodcuts bear more of a resemblance to modern-day engravings, where the lines are really fine, and the artist cut away everything else, so it seemed like a lot of effort went into actually removing the surface, whereas more modern prints, as we see here, which is almost from 1,000 years later, from 1832, 1833 range, and originating from Japan, has a much more sophisticated, complex look, and they're actually using more wood to carry the ink. Woodcuts are made from blocks of wood. Traditionally, you would call the block of wood that the artist is working on the matrix in which the print is going to eventually be made from. Now, the matrix also applies to metal when there's people that do engravings and etchings as well. Might be a little hard to define in terms of modern-day printmaking, where the computer is used and it may go directly to a digital printer, and there is not necessarily a matrix or some physical thing where the print comes from that the artist carved into. This woodcut was made from 4 separate blocks. The lightest color usually goes down first, and the artist will finalize with the black ink on top.
This is one of the most well-known prints around. It's a woodblock print from Katsushika Hokusai titled The Wave from around 1830. This originally started off as a watercolor from Hokusai. He also supervised a transfer of this to woodblock. Sometimes for Hokusai's paintings, they used up to 20 woodblocks. That means each separate color was a separate carving. And to line it up back then with such perfection before modern tools and such is quite incredible. So imagine having to make multiple prints of this, printing 20 different blocks. Very, very time consuming. Here is a completely different approach to a woodblock print. It's from 1912 by artist Emil Nolde, titled Prophet. This is a much more expressive piece than Hokusai's The Wave, meaning that much more in technical terms that the lines are rougher, the way it's printed doesn't have the precision that we saw in Hokusai's print. Hokusai's also was a multi-block print. This is just a single block print. But Emil Nolde also was a part of the German Expressionist art movement. They had the tendency to focus a lot more on emotional issues, conveying a sense of that through an image. This print is by Rockwell Kent, titled Workers of the World Unite, from 1937. This is also made from a wood block, but it's not necessarily called a woodcut. This is a wood engraving. It's made on a denser wood, and it's also done more with engraving tools rather than having everything cut away so much as it is with the normal woodcut print. Elizabeth Catlett's Sharecropper from 1970 is also a relief print. It's just done with different materials. It's made from linoleum. It's a color lino cut. Lino cut's short for a linoleum cut. This is done in the same sense that a woodblock print is done. Linoleum is much more forgiving, meaning it's really soft to carve a way through. There's a good chance that if some of you all had art through your early education, that you may have had an opportunity to make a linoleum cut.
In this slide we have an installation view and a close-up of a tire from Cities on the Move in 2004 by Betsa B.A. Romero. This is an unusual take on printmaking, that the matrix, so to say, is not necessarily what is customary, being a block or a sheet of some sort. It's actually the tire. She carves Mexican popular culture motifs in relief into the tire and uses that to print on these long sheets of fabric.
The next printmaking This is an engraving by the master Albrecht Dürer. It's titled The Night, Death, and the Devil from 1513. Earlier in the lesson, I mentioned that printmaking began in China, but it was developed in Europe in the 1500s. Albrecht Dürer is one of the main artists to contribute to the development of printmaking during that time period. This is an engraving. It's done by scratching into a metal plate with a tool. There is a tool called a burin. You can also use a twisted scribe, such as I use, and other types of engraving tools. You can actually even scratch into it with a nail if you need to. When you're making a print, you actually have to imagine what it's going to look like after it's printed, because you have to scratch it in backwards, basically. So this does take a lot of skill, very time consuming. Our dollar bills are actually made with this type of process. Our next intaglio process is etching. This image here is from Rembrandt. It's titled Christ Preaching from 1652. Etchings are done differently than engravings are. You have to prepare your plate by covering it with a lacquer that can be sometimes wax. Asphaltum is what I use for my etchings. It's basically kind of a tar type mixture. You heat up your plate, put the method, either wax or asphaltum, on the surface. You usually have a heating plate that it goes on so that it kind of melts to your surface. You pull your plate off of it afterwards, and you do use an engraving tool, the twisted scribe, as I mentioned before, or a burin. But it's a little bit different. You really don't try to scratch into the metal. You're more just trying to scratch away the waxy surface, which acts as a resist. It needs to resist because after you are done scratching it, you put the plate into acid. I particularly use nitric acid. There are different types of acid that you can use as well, but it basically burns into the surface of the plate. You have to take the waxy surface, the asphaltum, off with kerosene afterwards, and then it's ready for printing. It's done in the same process where you roll ink over it and the ink goes into the grooves that you cut. This print by Mary Cassatt, titled The Letter from 1891, uses multiple intaglio processes. It uses aquatint, etching, and dry point. We've discussed etching already in the last slide, and dry point is basically the same process as engraving, where with a dry point, no wet surface that has to be melted on top. You just scratch dry into the surface of the plate. And aquatint, which is done nowadays with spray paint. You would block out the area that you want to have affected, say for example the wood color or the surface of the desk, her dress, or the chair that she's sitting in. You would spray it with spray paint, and once the spray paint dries and you bathe the plate in acid, the acid would eat between all of the dots that the spray paint makes. In the old days, they would make aquatint with resin. It would be done hot in a similar fashion as you do with the asphaltum when you're making an etching, but it's in powdery dots and would melt onto the plate and also leave kind of a textured gradient type of pattern. If you think about a way a print is made today on a inkjet printer, it's kind of the same process where it's just thousands and thousands of little dots of color. I just thought I would throw something of mine in. I also, in my printmaking phase, was doing multiple intaglio processes together, aquatint, etching, and dry point, just like Mary Cassatt. Of course, mine looks a lot different. I did explain to you at the beginning of the lesson that you get many different results through different printing processes, but this is titled An Egg a Day Keeps the Embryo at Bay. Next is lithography. Lithography is a surface or planographic printing process based on the mutual antipathy of oil and water. You make your lithograph on a slab of Bavarian limestone traditionally. They also have a few other lithographic processes that we won't really get into that are done on metal plates. But traditionally, when you're transferring your image, it's called a direct method. You draw onto the surface of the stone with a wax pencil or a litho crayon. You can also draw on it with a ink-like liquid called tusche. After the image is done being transferred, it is treated with some gum arabic and a small amount of acid that fixes it to the surface. Next, you blot the surface of a stone with a sponge or some type of rag and water, and you roll ink over the surface afterwards. The ink will not stick to the areas where the water is on the exposed areas of the stone. The other areas that have been covered with ink and treated with the gum arabic and acid, it'll hold the ink in. It's really interesting to watch it because you will be rolling over something with a giant ton of black ink, but it does not stick to the surfaces that are exposed. This lithograph has an interesting story. It's by Honoré Daumier, titled Rue Transonia, from April 15th, 1834. You can kind of look at this as something similar to a crime scene photograph in combination with a crime scene reenactment. Daumier made this in one night. It was printed in the following day's newspaper after hearing of an event where some innocent people were shot in an apartment. Lithographs are often mistaken for drawings because you actually do draw onto the stone. Some people get confused. Another thing with lithographs is they can be much more quickly produced than, say, an etching or an engraving. Those are just much more time consuming.
In this slide, we have two lithographs and a photograph of Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec. Lautrec gained fame in Paris in the late 1800s by making lithographic portraits of Parisian nightlife, famously for the Moulin Rouge, Folies Bergère, but he wasn't certainly limited to those clubs. You may also recognize his name as being one of the characters in the movie Moulin Rouge, which came out several years back. In this slide, we can also see the versatility that you can get out of a lithography, something from a simple sketch to a fully realized full-color poster.
Stencil is another printmaking method. It's been popularized in recent years by many graffiti artists for its ability to allow you to come in quickly and make a work of art and leave, because you can take your stencil, put it on the surface of a wall or anything, and basically spray paint it. And here you can definitely see that Kim McCarthy, in this image, Urban Buddha from 2009, that some of that influence of graffiti artists is in there. You see the dripping paint. It kind of emulates that done quickly process that was popularized by graffiti artists. But artists, of course, soon adapted those methods and translate them into different methods, such as this particular print. Screen printing is a printmaking method that most of you are possibly aware that you're familiar with. All of our t-shirts in general are made with this process. You can print from one color to multiple colors on top of each other with screen printing. It's also done for posters, say for the festival here in town or for the Jazz Fest in New Orleans. They're made with this process. They're also sometimes made with lithographs as well. But you have a sheet of paper, a squeegee, and ink. Ink is pressed through a frame that has silk on it. The way you have an image transferred to that silk is you cover the silk mesh with an emulsion. It's a photographic emulsion that, when you expose to light, basically softens so that water can wash through. So you put a positive image, like a drawing or any type of text, like a school logo, on a transparency, and you lay it on top, expose it to light for a certain period of time, wash it out under water, and that allows ink to pass through for printing. This is a little protest piece about the use of pesticides in certain types of farming. It's titled Sun Mad from 1982 from Esther Hernandez. Besides being a protest piece, it's also a little bit of a pun on the sun-made raisins that most of you all probably have had at one time or another. But if you look at the original box, these are all very close to each other. Of course, the woman has been replaced with a skeleton instead. But this is a multicolored screen print. This work is from Elizabeth Murray. It's titled Exile from 38 from 1993. This is a multi-process piece. It uses lithography, screen printing. It also has hand-drawn crayon and pencil marks on top of it. This is something a little bit different because it's harder to create multiples of something like this that has such a personal touch, but many artists do choose to kind of push their prints to the extreme and really combine techniques to where it's really hard to tell what methods they were using. For our last three slides, we'll be looking at the current directions where printmakers are taking the medium. This piece is from Ellen Gallagher. It's titled Mr. Terrific from Deluxe from 2004-2005. This is basically a social commentary piece. Gallagher takes these prints from newspaper ads back in the 1940s and 50s, where products were being promoted to African Americans to basically change their skin and their hair color to make them more white, in a sense. She basically takes these elements but really plays off them by putting these polymer clay elements on top of these really bizarre little sculptures that she has. These are also, just like the last image we look at, hard to kind of completely recreate for mass production. Therefore, they're a lot more precious because they're very individualized.
Usually printmaking involves making multiples, an addition, a series of some sort. Now this can be a little broader in the terms when we look at this image right here. The snow globe is mixed media, but it does fall a little bit into the printmaking category because there are all multiples made. It has to have a consistency to it every time to make each snow globe look the same. Sometimes to get this consistency, paint will be applied to the things on the interior by using a stencil. There may be a little bit of hand painting involved as well. The snow actually does work in this, so you can shake it up just like any standard snow globe. So this is a little bit different than what we look at from printing, but nowadays printing is so broad, we have 3D printers that actually can print weapons. That there's a whole new slew of laws that are coming about to try to prevent the distribution of this. So we really have to think of printing in really, really modern terms when we talk about contemporary approaches.
We are now at the end of our lesson on printmaking. The last image we'll be looking at is from Nicola Lopez. It's titled Blighted, from 2006. Printmakers nowadays are really trying to push the medium because it has been done for so long, and with printing also being a part of our everyday lives, on boxes, on t-shirts, posters, CDs, and the such, that sometimes the art can really get lost. So Lopez really tried to push the medium by printing on mylar and basically curling them, cutting them out, and mounting them on the walls. This is supposed to basically symbolize the destruction that she remembered from September 11th, 2001. So that's the end of our lesson on printmaking. Thank you for listening.